Okay, I think we will make a start, because if we start promptly, we can finish promptly. Thank you very much for joining us for this plenary session. I'll introduce the format very briefly so that you know what to expect, and also introduce the rationale. So why are we gathering here? To think about teacher education again. I'd also would just like to say thank you to all the presenters that I've seen, and I know other colleagues will have seen during the week, who have continued to help us think. And it's possible that some of what's going to be said this afternoon now is informed by what we've heard, because this is an entirely unrehearsed, you may already be regretting being here, entirely unrehearsed session. And indeed, we hope that that freshness is one of the things that brings the conversation to life. So I have almost entirely forgotten what the title is. It's something to do with teacher education. No, it's not teacher education in crisis. That was another one. Thinking differently, challenging the status quo in teacher education. And what I was asked to do was to host a session where we brought together people who work in, think about, write about, care about teacher education now and in the future, from all of the four, and I'm reluctant to call them nations, but all of our four places. So we have people from Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and England represented in our conversation. I'm going to let them enter into conversations with each other with a particular format and structure that just helps that happen. We've used this a number of times. We've used this live and we've used this online. So for some people, this might be a bit of a repeat performance, but this is a completely fresh conversation. These people haven't had these types of conversations before. It came to me in the bath about 5 years ago, the notion of a chain reaction conversation. And some of you may know the term or the name chain reaction from the BBC 4 Radio 4 series, where each week in the series they introduce another person to be interviewed, but it's the person who was interviewed last week who becomes the interviewer of the next guest. And they choose their next guest, and they create this chain reaction conversation across each series. And I was literally lying in the bath thinking, how can we launch Collective Ed, our research centre, which focuses on the power of professional conversation in a way which is fun and new and different. And I thought a chain reaction conversation would be lovely. So that's what we did. And we focused in on coaching and education on that occasion. And we actually recorded it. We turned it into focus group analysis, and we wrote from it. So it was a very handy hour of conversation. And I think this will be a very interesting 40 minutes or so of conversation, with a little bit of time at the end for you to contribute, to ask any questions, to reflect. But we are definitely finishing on time. And when I say that, I also mean please be, I know this sounds mean, if you've heard something really interesting, can you follow up with our guests by email? Because everybody's got a train to get or a car to get to go back to. So, the notion of challenging the status quo is perhaps becoming more and more imperative, but also potentially more and more difficult in relation to teacher education in England, certainly, and it'd be interesting to hear more about what's going on elsewhere. We're only ever going to have two people on the stage at once, so there's a little bit of shuffling around between each conversation. Each conversation lasts for 8 minutes, and at the end of the 4 times 8 minutes, I may or may not reflect, depending on whether something particular has resonated. But what I'll certainly do is invite you to contribute. Or actually, first of all, I'll just say, just turn to people near you if you want to take a couple of minutes to reflect. And then if there's any thoughts that you want to contribute more publicly or questions, you're welcome to. But I'm going to introduce they're going to introduce themselves. They're adults, they're grown-ups, they can do that. I am going to encourage my first two conversants onto the stage. And I will allow them to do their own introductions.
Okay, Martin, would you like to introduce yourself?
Okay, thank you, Pinky. Is it morning or it's afternoon? Good afternoon, everybody. Very nice to be here, and thanks to Rachel for organising this. My name is Martin Hagan, and from the accent I'm sure you can detect that I'm from Northern Ireland. I work in St Mary's University College there, which is affiliated to Queen's University, and I'm head of education there with primary responsibility for initial teacher education at primary and post-primary as well.
Thank you. And I'm Pinky Jane, and I work at Leeds Beckett University, and my role is parallel, I guess, to Martin's role, which is Head of Teacher Education. And I've been in post for, this is my 3rd year, so you can just imagine my first 2 years. So Martin, what's been really brilliant in the last 3 days is we've heard lots of various perspectives from Ireland, Northern Ireland, and around. Do you want to just talk to us a little bit about what your year has been like and the things that have been going on in teacher education within Ireland?
In short, nothing. And that unfortunately is the truth of the matter. Teacher education in Northern Ireland is very different to the other regions of the UK. And from some of the things that I've heard over the past couple of days, I'm really delighted about that. When I hear about golden threads and Jan's pot and noodle, which is much more appropriate, I thought, I'm really glad that we are different. And there are a range of different ways in which things work in Northern Ireland. It's a kind of a game of two halves. On the one side, there's a lot which is really good and really positive. If we take, for example, partnership. Our partnership with the schools is really strong. And that's partly because the place is small. And a lot of the teachers, certainly in the primary sector, most of the teachers would have come through one of the 4 institutions. There are only 2 universities in Northern Ireland and 4 teacher education providers. So it's all quite small and close-knit. So partnership with schools is really strong. And the partnership is based on altruism. So teachers feel a kind of a moral obligation in terms of supporting student teachers. And that's a really good thing, and that works very, very well for us. As well as partnerships with the schools, as I say, there are 2 universities and 4 institutions. We work very closely together, not in a competitive way. USET NI has been really instrumental in supporting us in what we do and how we manage to get through COVID, for example, and things like that. So our partnership there is very strong. Very different from here in England is that our partnership with the Department of Education is really strong as well. And it operates very much on a collegial basis. They listen to us. When they want to know something about teacher education, they come to USET NI and they ask us questions. At times, I mean, we were developing a new competence framework recently, and the department were involved with that. And because they're civil servants, they wanted lists, like you had in the teacher education in crisis session, Rachel, where you had a list which was called a map, which wasn't a map, which was really just a list. As civil servants, they wanted kind of lists of competences. And we had a long discussion and debate with them to say, well, if you have a list for teacher education, first of all, it's probably going to be out of date the second it's published. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, it's going to exclude a lot of people because they won't be able to see themselves in that list or find themselves in that list. And what we wanted was a much looser and a much more flexible competence framework within which people could find themselves, very much dependent upon their particular context. So someone teaching in a 2-teacher rural primary school has a very different world experience to someone who's teaching in a very large city grammar school, for example. So we wanted something which would be inclusive to all and which would have a shelf life, which wouldn't go out of date immediately. And the Department of Education listened to us, and that was what happened. So our partnership with them is really strong as well. Similarly, our equivalent to Ofsted, the Education and Training Inspectorate, we call it, our partnership with them is very strong, and they act very much in the role of critical friends on a collegial basis. The inspection processes are self-evaluative in nature. And so all of that provides for a foundation for teacher education, which is very different, I think, to here. I mean, there are many other positives, and I don't want to paint too glowing a picture here, because there are problems and negatives, and we can maybe come on to those if you would like as well.
So just a little bit of reflection on what do you feel maintains that positive relationship, and what can we learn from you in terms of trying to push that boundary so that we can kind of, think about maybe converting our DFE to be more positive.
Good luck. I think, as I said a moment ago, Northern Ireland is a very small place, and people know each other well. The teacher education system is very small in itself. And historically, I mean, there have been problems in terms of policy development, for example, because of the nature of the place that it is. I mean, it's a politically contested place, as you know, and there are issues around that. So, for example, in terms of teacher education policy, a process was initiated in 2003. That led to a series of working groups and a series of papers which were published. There was a synthesis paper then in 2005. So keep up with the dates and listen to the dates carefully here. 2005. And then the strategy was published as a result of that. But the strategy wasn't published until 2016. So, and there's a whole raft of reasons why that was the case. The strategy is now sitting on the shelf. As a result of that strategy, that's where we were developing the competence framework and so on. So, I mean, whilst you're going at a hell-raising pace in terms of change and development here, I mean, we really are the snail in the background here. It's go slow and stop. And that is extremely frustrating, because that very nice foundation that I outlined earlier on, my frustration is that it's good, but it could be so much better just with getting our act together. And that's a big problem for us in terms of policy development, for example. That was quick. Thank you.
Martin, you're staying on the stage.
I'm staying, I think, yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, Anna, would you like to introduce yourself? Tell us where you're from and what you do.
Of course. So my name is Anna Beck. I work in Glasgow University in the School of Social and Environmental Sustainability. So not within the School of Education. We have an education team, quite a small one, within the school that I'm in. It's a rural-based campus, so we work from Dumfries, so south of Glasgow.
Okay. So I painted a glowing picture of Northern Ireland there, but really I suppose Scotland has, for the past number of years, been seen as kind of the doyen of teacher education. It's the go-to place that we all aspire to, perhaps. Is that still the case, do you think?
Yes, I think we've had quite a large reform of teacher education within Scotland from 2011 with Teaching Scotland's Future was the report that kind of set off that change. We're now over 10 years since the publication of that report, and I think we can see a number of structural and cultural changes within teacher education. But I think there is a sense, when you said that thing about almost like a sense of conservatism, and a lot of people felt like that change didn't go far enough. However, I feel that change has been very positive. The way I would describe it is it very much sees the need for teacher educators to support the development of student teachers as agents of change. It really focuses on teacher agency, empowerment, partnership, and positions teaching as an intellectual profession that should remain within universities. So one thing in Scotland that we're quite proud of is that we've managed to resist Teach First so far. However, what I'd say is that although we have these positive aspects, change is never that far away. And in Scotland, sometimes I think we're at risk of assuming that these changes won't impact us. So the changes that we're seeing in England just now, for example, they're never that far away in Scotland, and you can always see the small, tiny, tiny little bits of that trying to sneak into the profession. And I think what we do within teacher education is try to resist that and to create student teachers that can resist that as well as they become teachers working within schools.
Is it fair to say that the GTC is very instrumental in preventing that creepage of discourse change?
Yes, absolutely. So they are a huge player within teacher education in Scotland, a big policy actor, and they very much support the idea of teaching as an intellectual profession and withholding those ideas within Teach Scotland's future.
Okay. In that regard, then, I mean, there are emerging problems, I gather, in Scotland, for example, in regard to recruitment of students. So how does that kind of pan out?
Absolutely. So there have been a drop in numbers that have been applying for teacher education this year and the previous year. There have also been quite a few problems in terms of teachers coming out of their probation year. So in Scotland, you get a guaranteed probation year through the teacher induction scheme. There's been a number of problems with teachers coming out of that scheme and getting into full-time employment. So that is something that we are quite worried about, and we're not entirely sure how it's going to play out within teacher education.
And do a lot of graduates go elsewhere, you know, after the induction? Do they go elsewhere to work because they can't get work in Scotland?
I'm not sure of the numbers, actually. I think some will go abroad, absolutely, and some go into other professions.
That's an issue in Northern Ireland, a lot of graduates moving on elsewhere. I just wondered if it's the same in Scotland. In terms of the Donaldson Review, what would you say is kind of the legacy of that? It's kind of, as you say, it's a long time ago now, and maybe there's thoughts about further development. What do you think is the legacy of the Donaldson Review?
The legacy. So I think there's a number of things, but I think for me it's really that focus on teachers as agents of change. Whether or not that's actually happened within Scottish education, I'm not sure. But seeing the role of inquiry and engaging in and with research is really important to that. So inquiry is a really big part of our teacher education provision across Scotland, and seeing inquiry as something that empowers student teachers and using an inquiring stance, for example, to look at evidence that's maybe being brought in externally, to think about, is this going to work within my context? And supporting teachers to see that they can create their own evidence as well through inquiry within their schools.
And has that culture of inquiry filtered beyond initial teacher education into the schools themselves?
Yeah, I think you can see quite a big change, actually. It's quite a big thing within Into Headship, which is our preparation programme for school leaders, that has inquiry embedded within it. It's a key part of master's level learning as well. And I've been involved, Professor Kate Wall from Strathclyde's done a number of different projects with schools going into schools and supporting them to develop inquiry. I think there's still a bit of resistance to it, and it plays out in different ways. You know, some schools really get the way that we're trying to promote it and see the importance of it being bottom up and led by the teachers themselves. Other schools see it as very much a kind of top-down process, which is something different, I think, from the way that we try to teach it.
And in terms then of CPD, so initial teacher education is strong, I think, in Scotland. Mm-hmm. CPD, would it be on a similar level, a similar status, do you think?
Yeah, so that tends to be provided from universities as well. However, we have recently had our funding removed and restricted from government for professional learning. So that's going to have quite a big impact on the amount of teachers who can take part in university-led professional learning. And I think then we might start to see different organisations moving in to provide that.
And they're not there at the moment?
They are there, but I think they might start to take a more prominent role.
Okay. And how's that going down with the universities?
Oh, I think it could create a bit of tension.
Yeah. And also problem.
Okay, Andrew, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, my name's Andrew James Davis. I'm head of the School of Education at Aberystwyth University on the west coast of Wales.
Okay, and so can you tell us what's been happening in Wales?
Right. Well, I mean, thinking about the sort of theme of this, this particular session, I was sort of reflecting on, the ways in which the policy landscape in Wales has changed over the last sort of decade. And, we're coming up to 25 years of devolution in Wales. And I think we've seen a sort of ebbing and flowing of education policy from the policy laboratory post-devolution, where anything seemed possible, and we sort of, did away with a lot of accountability mechanisms. They were brought back and re-leveraged into the system, post-2010. And we've now sort of moved back again, I think, to a more proportionate position, I think, with accountability, and things are becoming possible again in terms of teacher education that, possibly weren't sort of 6 or 7 years ago, maybe. My own experience as a teacher educator tends to be in master's level learning. So one of the things that I am involved in at the moment, I'm looking around the room to see if there are any other colleagues who are. I can't see anybody. Is the National Masters in Education in Wales. And that was something, again, thinking about, challenging the status quo. We as a group of universities, 7 of us who deliver the scheme collaboratively, we had our status quo challenged by Welsh Government, who came to us and said, would you like to do this, but it will involve you working together, setting aside differences, setting aside your, maybe challenging your existing provision, the existing ecology and economics of your provision, but you're going to have to collaborate, in a collegiate way, come together and set differences aside. And that wasn't easy, as you may imagine, really. We had to think about, okay, well, do we want to be involved in this? Is it going to be easy to, not just to deliver, but to, we all, I'm sure, are familiar with the complexities of validation within one institution. Think about validating the same award within 7 institutions simultaneously. All of that was incredibly complex, and it started with a meeting in a drafty conference room on a Sunday in Llandrindod, Wales, because it was the only space in everybody's diary, and that was in 2018, and it took us probably 2.5 years to get to a place where we had a sort of coherent programme.
Wow. Okay, and what is the focus of that programme, if you could describe it?
Yeah, sure. So it's the National Masters in Education, brackets Wales, and we validated the main award, the sort of umbrella award initially, and we've now got 4 pathways: leadership, ALN, equity and well-being, and curriculum. I did remember them all. And so it's aimed primarily at early career teachers, but it's open to teachers from across the profession, and within IT partnerships as well, we're able to allocate places to partner schools as well. So there's a very interesting kind of ecology. It's a research and inquiry informed program as well. So that the sort of ethos again of challenging the status quo filters down to the level of inquiry and practice in schools as well.
Okay, and how do you see that as part of the wider education reform within Welsh education?
Yeah, I think it's, I think there is a coherent system in Wales. Wales, like any jurisdiction, is never perfect, but I think that we have an hospitable policy context, I think, that is supportive of research-informed practice. That the Masters doesn't sit on its own. These reforms kind of permeate initial teacher education all the way through to, to Masters level learning. The Welsh Government has funded a series of projects with HEIs and regional consortia, the sort of school improvement services, to bring inquiry-based learning into the classroom. There are two projects that we're involved in, the NPEP, the National Professional Inquiry Project, and another one that's more focused on the use of evidence in schools as well. So, the Masters doesn't sit on its own. It sits within an ecology of research-informed practice, which is developing and starting to bed down.
Mm-hmm, that sounds great. And do you have private providers who provide professional learning for teachers within Wales?
We do. but we're not really, I mean, I'm speaking only in terms of Aberystwyth at the moment. We don't currently engage with private providers in that respect, you know, not for any ideological reason, just because we don't at the moment. But I think the key collaborations for us have been with other HEIs, with the regional consortia, with the middle tier more generally, really, the sort of group of organisations kind of between government and practice. And there is, as I say, there is an aligned system beginning to emerge and solidify there, which is really exciting, actually.
And how do you see this playing out? How do you see it within 10 years' time, for example?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. As a researcher who's, as I was saying at the beginning, really kind of traced the the ebb and flow of educational policy, I wouldn't really like to predict. I think things are good now. We're enjoying it as it is, and hopefully, I think the strategic investment will pay off, and the impact will still be discernible within 10 years. But policy can change quite rapidly.
Yeah.
So we're going to start. I think I'm going to sort of start by asking you, I suppose, about the angst that we've heard about within the English system, the really sort of contested areas of debates that I think have informed a number of papers and panels during this conference. Would you like to give us your take on that and your experience of it?
What a gig, to try and end on a positive note, and they put England last. I mean, I think in the last, not to rehearse all the conversations that we've had, because I think we're all really well versed with that. In the last year, as an institution, I feel like I've apologised at a lot of meetings and gone, I'm very sorry for England and the policy. One of the things that, and if I try to keep it local, because I think we've had quite a lot of national picture talking, is it's made us rethink and reconfigure what we valued again, if that makes sense. And we've really had to go back and go, what the things that we used to take for granted, research-informed practice, value-based education, the purpose with which we inspire our teachers when we interview them, it's made us hold them on stronger, hold them dearer, and made us rethink, actually, maybe we just took it for granted. And that's why we've slowly creeped in for various reasons. So we've started as a group, as an institution, to collaborate in a very different way, because I think there was a hiatus on collaboration, a purposeful kind of let's sharpen your elbows, let's get competitive, let's be a market economy, in the region. So moving to a new region for me, was a really interesting picture when you look and go, oh, universities in the neighbourhood aren't talking to each other. Why is that? So I think that was the first way to not hold the status quo, is to say, okay, let's bring us together, even if it's for a coffee. So now we have a Yorkshire and Humber regional group that is so valuable. And I couldn't imagine how valuable it has become in the last couple of years, with the tensions of, quite often it's a small room to scream in, if I'm being honest. But I think that's the challenge we're facing, is we are done onto, but actually, how do we push back in a constructive way and hold on to what we all really know is the common sense, really strong approach? So that's been our piece of work. And I feel like there's a duality within that, and almost a sort of a schizophrenic approach to a certain extent, where we go, right, we'll do what we need to do to tick the boxes, but in reality, we're going to do this. And that's a difficult place to sit, for colleagues as well, because there is a fear, and you realise suddenly when you come to a new organisation where you don't know colleagues very well, is the level of fear that might be there, and what do I do to reassure, teams of very talented people that, yeah, you are thinking right, you're not going mad when you say, I really want to hold dear to this, research-informed approach, and that confidence that comes in being together. I know it feels really simple, but actually it's really important to keep reminding ourselves that we are not going insane, quietly, and to keep that reinforcement of conversation and coming back to what we value, has been the biggest challenge, I think, in the last couple of years. And we keep that battle. And it's sometimes the simple, and it really resonated with me in Melinda's conversation when she talked about changes made in meetings and in agenda items. And you kind of go, yeah, absolutely. That marginal gain of changing vocabulary and allowing people to go, yes, that thought is absolutely right. Forget the rhetoric out there, but in here, when we close the doors, have the confidence. If it's not good teacher education, then let's not do it, you know.
And, you know, you mentioned sort of extracting and focusing on the positives. How have you how has that sort of informed your programme design and your sort of conceptual framework of your programme?
Yeah, so we've done a major overhaul of our programmes, and I hasten to add everyone's probably going through that, and not because of the market review and not because we felt it was a good opportunity coming out of the pandemic and reviewing what we were doing to bring in freshness into it. And really thinking about the core values again and saying, okay, let's take, and I, you know, Ofsted out of it, let's take the policy out of it. What do we think makes good teacher education? Between all of my team, it's probably about 200 years of experience when you add everybody up. And actually, that has got to mean something. And so keeping it really simple and having that conversation of what is a good teacher at the end, you know, forget the tick boxes, forget all the rest of it, actually giving that space to the team to go, well, that's what I think good teaching looks like, that's what I want to see in my students, and that's how do we get them there, and then let's go back and design a curriculum. Now, it's not perfect yet, you know, it takes time and it evolves, but actually it's accepting that it's ongoing work. You know, and I think sometimes we're, by nature as teachers, perfectionists, and we want it all sewn up in a box, you know, all ready to go. But actually bringing in students' voices as well, because their voices have changed. You know, the students pre-pandemic were very different to post-pandemic. And in all of the milieu of battles that we've had, you know, I feel like it's a battle in the last 2 years, where's the student's voice? You know, where is that, you know, enthusiastic graduate teacher? I don't hear their voice, and we want to try and bring that back in again into curriculum design, and we're really trying to empower them, because one of the things that came out of one of our meetings was, well, they are the folks that are going to lead policy in the future. So if we don't encourage them now to think in a different way and empower them now, well, we're stuck with this. You know, so.
Thanks.
Thank you. Oh, okay.
Okay, so those were slightly quicker conversations than we sometimes have, but hopefully given us a sense of place, that our 4 jurisdictions are different, they are unique, but there is some shared concern. And I think, Pinky, your point at the end was really, really, really powerful. You know, actually, we are educating not just the teachers of tomorrow, but potentially the policymakers of 10 years or 20 years down the line. If we work for Teach First, they'd be 3 years down the line, then they'd be in the DFE, but we don't. So, gosh, it has certainly given me some things to think about. I'm actually not going to hog this space. I'm really interested in how anybody who's absorbed any of that or reflected on that in the light of other things they've heard in the conference, or thought about what's being shared here with respect to what they do, or you do in your work, what your thoughts are, what your comments are. Questions are welcome, but thoughts and comments as well. And if you don't mind, I'd really like to hear teacher educators' voices, if we've got anybody left in the audience. But I can't tell whether you are when you stick your hand up, so I can't discern that. We have one over there. Thank you. There's a mic coming. I've never said that before.
Thanks very much. This question's for Martin. I also teach at Queen's. I don't have a Belfast accent, but I do live in Belfast. And I suppose I would consider myself a sociolinguist. I look at education, English language education, provision across primary, secondary, community and higher education. And because Northern Ireland is now becoming much more diverse, and I have a lot of colleagues who are working within secondary schools and primary schools delivering EAL provision, there is, they feel, a huge need for the Northern Irish curriculum to become much more diverse. They feel it has been far too white. It hasn't been revised, I believe, since 2009. And what they're saying to me is that their first language has been eroded and it's been kicked out of their lives. Why? Because it's English-only policy. Now, although they may have been taught that in their initial teacher education, that their L1 is very important, not only for learning a second language, but for their identity and as part of their culture. The reality, anecdotally, I would say, within schools, it's English-only policy. And that has a detrimental impact on those students who are coming and going through a Northern Ireland education system. And I think that's much more important preserving than getting a C at GCSE, don't you think? So I'm wondering, where is the Northern Irish curriculum in relation to becoming much more diverse and inclusive, and I suppose less white?
It's a really good question, and it raises a whole range of other issues. I mean, if we look to the students that we work with who want to become teachers, invariably they're all white. They're all from Northern Ireland, in large part. I mean, the Chinese community, for example, has been in Northern Ireland since the 1960s. I've been in teacher education for 25 years, and I've taught 2 Chinese students. You know, so we do have a problem in terms of the lack of diversity in the teaching workforce, and we can see that very, very clearly. And there is a job of work to do because Northern Ireland is becoming much more diverse. There is a job of work to do to attract people from different places and different backgrounds into teaching as a career. And I think that's a very important thing to do. In terms of the curriculum, I mean, we do see certain schools, I mean, as I would go around certain schools, we do see, you know, signage and so on in different languages according to the population of the school itself. I can think of one school which is directly behind St Mary's, which is probably the most multicultural school in Ireland, perhaps, you know, and in a highly deprived area. And language is used and embraced in there in different ways. But I think, you know, if we're going to look to the curriculum, which was really the core of your question about changing the curriculum, it's back to the point that I made earlier. You know, policy development and making change in Northern Ireland goes at a really slow pace. So I'm sorry it's not an optimistic answer in that sense.
Thank you. There's another question here, and then we'll come over here. We'll do that one, and then we'll come here.
Thank you. I'm John Perry. I'm a teacher educator at the University of Nottingham. First of all, thank you for all of your contributions. You've used phrases I've never heard before, like, Martin, I'm sure you said you have good relationships with the Department for Education. Those are words I've never heard. So that's always interesting. I'd like to pick up and just kind of add a little bit to something that Pinky was kind of referring to there, that about the nature of our teachers coming through, and just in the context of England, that what we have now are teachers coming through who are now in schools, our ECTs, who are the first to sit the reformed GCSEs. So they have no experience of coursework for some subjects, and that will be increasingly the case. All they've known is this knowledge-rich curriculum, so-called knowledge-rich curriculum, and I just think it will be both very interesting. We use that word in schools, don't we, in the way of we have like an interesting Year 9 group to teach. But it'll be very interesting to see how they evolve, both as teachers, but as you said, very rapidly over the next 2, 3, 4 years into school leaders and shape not only the disciplines in which they're working, but soon the very school system, how their experience of being educated in multi-academy trusts, whatever form that they've experienced that in, how that plays out into their kind of lived experience as we say, teachers, but also the people who are shaping the school system. And I think, Rachel, when you were saying earlier in the conference that we need to hold the space, I think we in universities have a really massively important part to play in helping those people understand that their experience of schools is not the only experience, and that there are alternative ways to do it. But that is, hold the space is kind of a military term, and this is a bit of a fight. But I think we have to engage with that, and I think we have to do that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think we can see it as a threat, all the changes. I'm an eternal optimist. Or see it as an opportunity when they come to us to design, to support, to encourage and to change, the way that they see the world. And hasn't higher education always been a transformative space? So we need to remind ourselves of that as well. It's hard in teacher education when you are bombarded with lovely homework from the DFE, which, we all love. But to go beyond that, I think you're absolutely right. And I see it as an opportunity to make that change. And curriculum design really supports that. So, yeah, I bring it on, I say.
Thank you. We had a question here, or a comment, might be a comment. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amani. I'm from Scottish Education Research Association as the ECI Network Convener. And I see this event as a way you have this chain effect. I also wonder, if you continue this in the future, would it be possible for you to think about people like you work with as international scholars or your international colleagues join this? Because when I'm here, I see there are a lot of international scholars also coming around to talk about this. Maybe this chain could go like a continuing.
I think that's a fabulous idea. Thank you. We were asked, the brief was, let's make sure we represent the 4 jurisdictions, but I do think we need to take that idea, because one of the things that I'm grieving for at the moment is the loss of our Erasmus projects as a result of Brexit. And I know that in the last 6-7 years, my understanding, my learning has just evolved in ways that are beautiful. I just see those relationships as beautiful, and they're just our European partners. So thinking a bit more internationally again, and making sure that the conversations really do include others is a really critical thing, because we all have learned, even along this chain, thought differently, had our own status quo challenged. Including others would be a really vital part of the future. Thank you. Any other comments? There's a lady over here, and then if we're okay, we'll go to Paul. Yeah, lady here and then across to Paul. Sorry, I know there's a couple of different hands. I'm trying to see people.
Thank you. I went to Aberystwyth Uni, so hi. And it's sort of building on what Pinky said about what makes a good teacher, and we're revalidating at the moment. And I've talked about outdoor learning today, and we're talking about formal and informal and non-formal learning. And I think what scares me is the fact that there's so little autonomy out there, and how we approach that as institutions, and how we can minimise that. So through doing outdoor learning from year 1 all the way to year 4, and enabling the trainees to go out and lead on that in schools, so they're supporting the children of the future. But it's looking at that in a bigger context, and how do we promote autonomy, whether it's in England or across the board. And I don't know whether with Martin, that being behind is actually a benefit in terms of that autonomy, and giving them teachers the flexibility to make some of those choices.
Thank you.
I agree. I think, the things that are encouraging when students apply, for example, they're excited by, are really important things to hold on to. And I think it's always attention, time, the amount of curriculum content that we've got to cover. But I think part of it is always questioning ourselves and saying, what is it that's important? What do we want to prioritise? And I think there's always a way of weaving in what we want to prioritise. For example, outdoor learning is just something that I think if we lose, the side effect of that is that what we're saying to our trainees is that these things are not important. So they don't take that into their... And if we think back to our own teacher education, the things that were shown to us and we experience, we still hold dear when we go into classrooms. Some of those things fundamentally haven't gone. You know, they've formed our value base. So I think we've got to just keep fighting for it. You know, if it means extending the curriculum a little bit more and stretching our students, if they're excited, they're there, aren't they? I think if we just stick to what we're supposed to do, I can't think it must be soul destroying for students to experience more of the same, you know. So I think we've got to keep going at it. And any ingenious ideas of stretching time, please, on a postcard.
I'll see whether Martin wants to comment, but can I just add that when I joined Leeds Beckett, our campus is at Headingley, so it's a few miles out of the city centre. It's a beautiful green campus. We're very fortunate. And one of the loveliest things to stumble across was our Forest School area. Within the grounds of the campus, therefore within the reach of School of Education. And every now and again I stumble across children with students working there. I don't know, because I'm not in charge, how often that happens, but it's still a pleasure to see.
Yeah.
Martin.
Maybe just to say something else that people maybe haven't heard before. Teachers in Northern Ireland have a fairly high degree of autonomy in what they do as well. Despite the fact that we do have a Northern Ireland curriculum, it's more guidance than anything. And also my sister college, Stranmillis University College, there's a big centre for early years learning and research there as well. So there's really good work going on in regard to things like outdoor learning, particularly the early years already, I think.
Thank you. I know, Paul, you had your hand up, so if we go to Paul next.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the speakers. And I was almost weeping with frustration at hearing the stories. A very strong image jumped into my head when, Pinky, you were talking, and it's of a novel you may know. Ray Bradbury wrote it many years ago, Fahrenheit 451, the dystopian world where books are banned. Nobody has one. And the hope at the end of that novel was the fact that people had memorized books and they were walking around and keeping them in their heads so that when the day came, when the book could be released again, there was a whole range of, there's a library out there held in people's minds. And that came to mind when you were talking. I thought, that's what we're up to. We're holding that memory in our mind, in our classrooms, in our lecture theatres, and it's keeping going. And I'm just hearing now, of course, there are libraries all around us. And that question about internationalising, constantly, we have to keep those sources of inspiration and hope with us. But think of ourselves as you say, we're sort of holding the library for the next generation of teachers to grab it and run. So thank you very much for giving me that bit of hope.
Yeah. Oh, I'm going to remember that image now in my head as well. Thank you.
And it brought to mind something that I know happens in Harrogate. I live in Harrogate now. And a friend that I know who also lives there was telling me about things I could get involved with. And as of yet, haven't had time. But he was talking about a living library that is hosted at the library, I think, in Harrogate. But it's a regular event. I could honestly be making this up at this stage. It may be a very bad memory. But as my understanding is, it's a regular event where people go and have conversations with each other about their lived experiences, their lives, their stories. So that's the notion of the living library. And I've also actually seen a very similar format at a conference where the sense of the living memory, the lived experiences, the things that we embody as educators can be expressed through those conversations, that our knowledge is as vital as the knowledge that we might get from a journal article or a book on the shelf. Not more, not less, as vital. So I think the notion of educators, as teacher educators, we have a lot of living memory, and one of the shames will be if we lose some of that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the projects we are starting is to try and get all of my team to articulate their journey into teacher education, because I think students sometimes don't feel that journey and they feel it's perfection at the end. And so one by one, they don't know this yet, but they will now, is going to encourage them to talk about their journey, their ups and downs, their challenges, and to try and kind of have that pulling apart of what was the difference, what made you stay, because those are some of the things that we're struggling with. And actually sometimes we feel reluctant to talk about ourselves because it feels like we're oversharing, but actually it's quite informative and it feels real to students. So I think it just reminded me of the thing that's on my to-do list, which I shall put to the top of the to-do list.
And having said all of that, it's also reminded me that I failed to do what I said I would do, which is to give you a moment after the 4 conversations to maybe turn to the person next to you and share something. So I actually think that's important. If you're here for another minute or two, just if you wish to, how are you seeing the challenge in teacher education? How are you challenging the status quo? What tiny things do you do? What responsibilities do you take? If you would like to share, this is a moment to do that, and then we'll round up. And apologies, we may now not have time for any more comments or questions, but I do think I forgot that and I wanted to include it. So just give yourself a minute to turn to somebody and share. Okay. So I really hope that you found this a pleasant way to bring things to a close. We wanted it to feel different, a bit more intimate, perhaps certainly not a grandstanding keynote or even a panel where I think people you feel really obliged to have something really well prepared for a panel. I'm not saying they weren't well prepared, but do you know that sense of actually where are we now after a few days of thinking and how does it relate to what I do and what I believe in? I am really, really grateful to you as contributors. Thank you so much. They all said yes. They were the only people I asked. I didn't have to keep scrabbling around. They all said yes. Obviously, this would be a stupid thing to say, isn't it? But I didn't have to persuade them or do anything nasty. They are here, and I'm sure that anybody that would like to pick up a conversation with them, this could be the beginning of conversations, not just the end. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for wanting to contribute, for sharing the things that you've shared with each other. I really hope you have very safe and easy journeys home. Did you want to say anything, Dominic? Because you're chairing this session. Just stood in. Sure, do you not? No, nothing. He's got nothing for you. Sorry. There is lunch. We suggest if you need to go and get lunch, you do that. If you need to get a train, go and do that. But thank you so much for your time, and your energy, and your enthusiasm. Thank you.